Alan, welcome to the RevAmp podcast show. We are absolutely delighted to have you on board here today. And for those who don't already know you, please just maybe share a little bit about yourself, your role, and a little bit more about your company.
Yeah, sounds great. Gideon, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here and talk about revenue operations. So I'm Alan Wright. I work for Rocket.Chat. I'm the VP of Strategy and Operations. Rocket.Chat is a digital open source collaboration platform where we're focused on data privacy and security. So we have some of the most regulated, most heavily focused industries around security and data protection, such as US Navy, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bahn, the big railway networks in Germany. So we're a global company. We're growing. We just closed our Series A funding round. And now we're looking to, mature some of our sales motions, some of our product market fit and grow internationally. And me personally, my background. So I've spent 5 years in management consulting. And then after that, I spent about 8 years in sales strategy, sales management, and operations. First with Blackboard, working in their international group, Blackboard being an ed tech company. And then afterwards at RB Media, which is one of the world's largest audiobook publishers and digital distribution platforms. So I worked on their sales channel there.
So I think what's interesting about your background to your foreground is you've worked at larger orgs, more evolved processes, probably obviously more resources, and now you're in what could be described as a younger startup in earlier stages. So you build more of the end goal of what good could look like. But I think our backstory when we were discussing was that there isn't a one size fits all kind of sales process. You can't just say that because this is what worked before, this is what will work here. So how do you personally, Alan, define and shape a sales process that meets your go-to-market requirements? What are the key characteristics there that you identify?
Yeah, I think that's a great context, Gideon. So for me, one of the core responsibilities I had when I started in January here at Rocket.Chat was trying to build and establish a more rigorous, formal sales methodology and a revenue forecasting process. But I knew that I couldn't just take exactly the template that I had before and apply it, plug and play. So the first thing that I need to understand is, okay, what is the definition of the sales methodology that we use as a company at Rocket.Chat? What is the industry, our core competitive differentiators, and then what is the type of sales process that we had, right? Is it a more consultative sales process, which is true for us? Mm-hmm. And then try and fit within that context, what are the things that we need to put in place to be able to have more predictability, reliability, and future-oriented view of our revenue. And so the first foundations for it, this is kind of like the first principles first approach, is to be able to understand and establish the sales methodology. And so for us, I like to apply something that is simple but effective. There's a ton of different methodologies out there, and you can't really go wrong as long as you have a solid foundation. If it's your company, if it's your industry and your sales motion, and you're thorough and really diligent in how you apply it, right? For us, we used SPICED as the sales methodology, as the underlying basis for how we, qualify and progress deals through the pipeline. And
Alan, I'm going to ask the question, but what's SPICED? Tell me about that.
Okay, yeah, SPICED. Okay, so it's a 5-letter acronym, but it's really important because it helps you establish first the situation that the customer is in, mm-hmm. the pain that they feel, the impact associated with, okay, if you have a technology, you're trying to solve a problem for them, what is the impact, the benefit that your solution is going to bring? Then C can be a few different things, but we use it in like a compelling event sort of context where you're talking about, okay, why would this customer make a decision now to buy your product and implement your solution, right? What is that compelling event or that critical event that forces that decision? And D is the decision process too, so like the decision framework. So how that can be the sort of like buying process, or depending on the type of sales motion that you have. For us, it's more of like a product-led growth, a PLG strategy, which means that oftentimes you're dealing with one buyer and not necessarily a huge committee, but you still need to map, okay, how are they going to get budget to buy your product to be able to move forward. So Spiced helps you map that out. And one of my practical tips for our sales reps in applying the methodology, yes, it makes sense, and it would be ideal if you followed that curve, SPICED, in like a linear fashion, but that's rare in the sales world, right? So depending, you kind of meet your customer where they are, but it's super important to be able to, qualify a deal, make it a real opportunity that you can progress and potentially win, to really establish the pain and the impact in the beginning. And the conversation that we're having here, Gideon, is one of the foundational reasons and why this is the first step, at least for me, in applying a formal like sales methodology that is tied to a more rigorous forecasting process. It's because you need to be able to establish this, and you need to understand how you win, why you win, and why you lose, so that you can iterate and improve on that, and then drive the things like better win rates, faster sales cycle, higher ticket values, the sort of things that really drive revenue.
And what I was, because you implemented this methodology, how much time did you have to really choose the right methodology? Like, I imagine when you're in a relatively young startup, time is not always on your side. There's probably different processes that you could adopt. You don't know in advance which one will be the perfect fit for you, or even a good fit for you, maybe. How do you reconcile the need to iterate processes with the needs to make an impact sooner rather than later?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think any leader who steps into an organization with a clear mandate on something that you need to do, it's really important to think about quick wins. Like, what can you do that you can quickly contribute value and make improvements to the business right away? And then balance that with, either like the complexity, the depth of the methodology or problem that you're trying to solve. And for us in this context, it took about 2 months, right? So for me, the first 2 months were really spent meeting people, understanding the business, understanding how our processes worked, how they didn't work, what the biggest pain points were, and trying to understand, okay, without me here, what is the natural sales cadence, sales motion, sales process, and methodology that the team is currently using? And then based on that context, try and take what we see as best practices that are applicable to our consultative B2B SaaS sales motions that can impact the business and our revenue opportunities as much as possible, and we'll have quick adoption and adherence from the sales, right? So like, it's great, you can pick the best methodology and then try and implement something that doesn't work, and it's almost like organ rejection, right? Like, if people aren't going to do it, doesn't matter how good it is, right? And so you got to be able to fit with the culture and the context of the organization. So those 2 months were spent really like assessing those key issues. And then the third month was doing a pilot of essentially saying, okay, here's the methodology. We chose Spice. We have to explain why, we have to explain what the benefit is, what the impact is. And then you work through different sales leaders and different sales reps, people who are really key to adoption and success of implementing that program, to get them to buy in, right, and be involved in contributing to it and influencing it. And so we spent roughly about a month in that pilot period getting that feedback. And then in April of that year, so like basically month 4 is when we formally rolled it out.
So in month 1 and 2, your process for basically doing internal evaluation was mostly conversation driven, or did you go with baseline data points? I'm actually just going a level deeper now into your personal leadership style as to whether it was both, one or the other. Because I know sometimes when you have conversations, they tell you a different story than the data in an Excel spreadsheet, right? When people talk about experiences, or maybe when you step outside of the sales team into legal, whatever your version of legal ops would be, or various other departments. So yeah, how did you get a good baseline?
Sorry, we had a little bit of a delay there. Yeah, I got the question again. So how did we do that? How did we approach it? For me, there's essentially like 3 key pillars that define how you do that. The first one, conversations are super important. You want to be able to engage people from their experience and extract the sort of like insights, that can inform decisions like which sales methodology and program to select. So that's key, but that's not the only thing. If you base it all off of that, I think your chances of success would be rather limited. The other two that I pretty much universally apply to whatever I do, and I think this is, especially for revenue operations, is super relevant, is one, analyzing data. So taking the historical data, trying to understand, okay, by segment, by industry, by geos, what are, you know, the critical factors that you look at from sales performance and sales productivity, being, you know, average ticket values, deal size, cycle time, right? How much time the deals are going through, where they get stuck in the different stages of the sales process that you have, and then the overall, you know, win rate and close rates that you have, and you can apply conversions in different places. So taking data and actually analyzing the historical patterns are super important. And I would say the excuse that some people have in like a startup world is like, oh, our historical data isn't good, so it's not worthwhile to do it. We here at Rocket.Chat had some similar sort of experiences, but even 6, 9, 12 months of data is sufficient to be able to give you some direction. It may not be perfect to give you pure clarity and insights on what the decision should be, but that's super important. So that's item number 2. Item number 3 is external benchmarking, right? So do some market research, see what are the sort of best practices, methodologies that apply, and try and see what is most transferable and applicable to your industry, company context, right? And so I combine all of those 3 factors in helping to inform the sort of decision that we would go with. And previously, I had only used SPICED in one of my prior companies. Like Blackboard is a little bit more old school, and we used BANT, right? Budget, authority, need, timing, the traditional kind of solution selling methodology. And I felt like, you know, especially for a product-led growth company, things have evolved a bit more. And something else was better suited for us here at Rocket.Chat.
Okay, very good. So all of that, now we're going to fast forward to all of the prep, to the selection. Now we're at the point of the rollout. Were there any key ingredients to successful rollout? Maybe even in retrospect, either the things you did well or the things that you learned from that process?
Yeah, I think so. 2 things we did well, and 1 thing that we could improve, and I think that's super important and pretty universally applicable. So 2 things that we did well, I think getting broad alignment across the leadership of the organization. So our structure is somewhat unique, where we have a general manager who's responsible, who's like the number 2 in the organization, has a sales background, and has a lot of influence in the sales organization. So having his buy-in and input is super important. We have a VP of sales who similarly has a even longer history with Rocket.Chat and the company, and has a ton of experience and a ton of perspectives on how he thinks sales should work. And then we also have other parts of the organization that are less kind of central to the actual implementation and execution of the sales methodology, but depend on it and are influencers. That's like pre-sales, professional services, customer success. And so making sure that that leadership team is bought in and aligned with the methodology, the rationale behind it, is super important. And then number 2, so like leadership alignment in brief, that's super important. Number 2 is the manner in which that you communicate it to the sales organization. So I've tried to apply my lessons learned from previous, where, you know, you get a bunch of smart people in the room, they think they have the right decision, and they just want to move as efficiently and effectively as possible in rolling something out. And that you might be right theoretically about what you want to do, but when you think about adherence, adoption, and actual execution of that methodology, you depend on the people who are in the field, right? The sales team. And so it's super important to do the thing that I mentioned earlier, which is like a proof of concept, some sort of pilot, where you involve the people who are actually going to be responsible for delivering it in shaping, influencing, and testing out what the methodology is, but doing that in an authentic way, where you take their feedback, you take their experience, and then improve and influence and change something about the process. Not necessarily everything, because if we listen to every bit of feedback from sales reps, we wouldn't have necessarily like coherent and effective methodology. But their input and perspective was super important in shaping the final version of our methodology that we implemented. So those are the 2 things that are good. I don't know, Gideon, if you have a question or point on that before I get to what we could do better.
Go ahead. go ahead with what we could do better.
Yeah, the part that we could do better. So, and overall, I think this is universally applicable, not just in like sales methodology, but broader, revenue operations and any sort of like change management thing, is the time that you dedicate to training and enabling new people who come on board. So especially for a fast growth company like us, what we didn't do well enough is have a onboarding and enablement program that did the sort of like in-depth enablement training that we did for our cohort of sales reps who were already on board when we implemented in April, and do it in a kind of cyclical fashion where you pull in the new people and give them the same sort of like context, background, explanation on why this is the methodology and why you're implementing it. And so what you can see now is we have a bit of stronger adherence with the people who were here in place when we launched it versus the new people who are coming on board to the company. So I think in terms of developing a training and enablement program aligned with what you're launching, it's super important to consider that like cyclical basis of how many new people you're going to be bringing in and how they fit into the overall program.
I guess if you didn't have that enablement for new hires, then probably you didn't measure the KPIs of new hires in terms of ramp time, efficiencies, learning times, like all of the KPIs around that. Like if you don't have someone that's responsible, then you're probably not even measuring the efficiency of the education process. I know you'll probably measure targets and quota and whatever ramp quota, because everybody does, but that's not the same thing. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. And yeah, it's essentially like taking the concept of time to value and applying it to the new entrants to the sales force, and making sure that you measure those things in some sort of like quantitative, objective way. And it's not just, it's a sort of thing that we did more in hindsight, where we would look back and then we would try to extract data to fit that in, but we didn't actually measure as they were onboarding how productive they were, how much adherence they had to the program. So that's something that is definitely a lesson learned for the future.
So now that you have your cohort and you have your new hires, you've implemented SPICED as a methodology, and you're several months beyond all of that. Where do you stand now in the process? Now that things are more mature, what's the kind of present next step for the evolution or maturity of that sales process?
Yeah, so there's a few factors here for us. The maturity and evolution starts with the like coaching that we're starting to implement, and I'll be specific of what that means, because like obviously sales coaching is something important, but how does it fit in the context of the SPICE methodology and the sales methodology that we're implementing? And we're discovering now that we've we actually just in the last few weeks got on board our sales managers for all of our different like verticals and markets. And so we're taking the time with their contributions and leaderships to investigate how well, in fact, are sales reps doing things like discovery, right? Which in the discovery phase of an opportunity, it's the sort of like pre-pipeline, top of funnel. You have to do the 3 essential things in SPICE. The first thing's really, really well. Understand what their situation is, understand what their pain is, and then map that to an impact that matters to them, that will that they'll ascribe value to, and that they'll be able to make a decision around that quickly, right? And what we're discovering here is, especially between our like sales development reps, our SDRs, and the sort of like marketing functions, demand generation, and then the handoff to our account executives, that discovery piece is something that we need to improve quite significantly. And I think the maturity of it is now having a sales enablement team properly stood up, having sales managers that their core roles and responsibilities are to be able to identify those gaps or those areas of improvement, and then building a sort of program behind it to, listen to calls, to analyze data, to get feedback from the field on what's working, what's not working, and then make sure that you're being tactical enough in providing tips, advice, and direction to the sales reps to improve, in fact, how you do discovery in this case. So that's one thing that was super, super important. The second thing is thinking more broadly. So like we're implementing SPICE in a sales methodology, for its own sake, right? It's intended to drive revenue. It's intended to improve sales rep productivity. And so one of the things that we're doing with that is tying in a more formal, more structured, established cadence around sales forecasting that reinforce the need to be able to apply SPICED effectively, right? So that's like our accountability mechanism where through the forecasting, we're both measuring, identifying progress and coaching the team on how to improve the way that they apply the SPICE methodology and strengthen their forecast. And then by doing that, in turn produce, better results when it comes to revenue. So I think having a really strong loop where whatever sales forecasting methodology and cadence you establish is really, really tightly connected to the way that you use and apply the sales methodology. And so I think we're at that point of maturity and evolution in the adoption curve and kind of the methodology overall.
Was there a point number 3 related to that, or a solid 2 point?
I think a solid 2 point. I consolidated the second one into 2 because I was going to talk about forecasting as a separate thing, but I really think it's just, the revenue generation and the outputs and hard results that you have is a product of how you apply those 2 things.
And have you been able to create not even a feedback loop, a communication loop back to the sales org of the difference that they've made by adopting the SPICE methodology, etc.? Has there been kind of that passing the ownership back to them of this is the difference that you've made?
I'd say we're at the point where that is starting to happen. So, for example, when we close the second quarter of the year, we're on a calendar year. So when June ended in July, we did our first formal quarterly win-loss analysis using data and then trying to identify, okay, why did we lose in certain contexts? What are the patterns, behaviors, and reasons behind it?
Yep.
And then through that is actually how we really honed in on the need to improve discovery, because we were getting a lot of lost reasons for things that honestly I would say are a bit of BS, like no reply, the customer ghosted us, etc. And I was like, that's only happening if in fact you're not doing qualification and discovery well, because either it shouldn't be an opportunity, right? Because you haven't identified a pain, you haven't mapped their impact, or we're not doing enough in qualification to be able to establish that solid foundation where they see value in it. So I think we're at the point where we're applying the lessons learned from, okay, now we have a formal sales methodology, we have a forecasting process, and now we're starting to take that learning and then the accountability and responsibility for driving improvements on it in terms of productivity, revenue results is really on the field, right? The sales reps, the managers, and we're at the point where we're starting to do that. I would be, selling ourselves a little bit too much, saying that we have in fact a really strong and effective iterative feedback cycle where we're like, okay, we know how to do that. I see a vision forward where if we continue to do this in the right way and we've established the cadences to kind of reinforce that will be there, but we're probably 3 to 5 months away from saying that we have a process like that in place.
Great. Well, I'm a huge advocate for strong discovery. I think it solves a lot of problems. So great point, I think, for us to finish on here today. And because I asked you to share your learning as we went through the conversation, I don't think there's a need to kind of do it again now. But Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure to learn with you and from you. Thank you on behalf of myself and all of the RevAmp team over here at DealHub. And I look forward to reconnecting with you kind of another 6 to 12 months down the road and seeing how this journey plays out for yourself and your team over there at Rocket.Chat. Wishing you guys tons of success.
Thank you, Gideon. Yeah, it was a pleasure here. I appreciate the opportunity, and similarly wishing you and the DealHub team a ton of success.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Take care.